September 27, 1943. The altimeter needle slides past 2,000, then 1,000 feet. For a moment, there's nothing between the pilots and the patchwork of fields below but the roar of two R-2800 engines and a thin sheet of aluminum under their boots. The world compresses. Wire fences, a cart stalled by the hedge, a woman's laundry snapping like small flags in a wind that smells of cut hay. They are doing the unthinkable. They are giving up the height. This was not an act of bravado. It was a bet against doctrine. For years, every flight manual and instructor had drilled the same command into young pilots: never give up your height. Altitude was currency, potential energy converted into maneuverability and the split second to climb, dive, and evade. But by the late summer of 1943, that currency was bleeding away. The 8th Air Force was paying steeply for orthodox tactics. High-altitude escort fighters were meeting German interceptors on the way to and from the bomber streams, and too often not coming home. Losses at altitude were mounting, and numbers reported from the front suggested the situation was unsustainable. Someone needed to question the rule. Major Hubert Zemke, probably the man the field reports point to, did not come to his conclusions in a lecture hall. He came from the cockpit. Faced with repeated combat reports and after-action figures that made the math look ugly, he did what frontline commanders sometimes must do. He asked a blunt question and then authorized an experiment. If the conventional path was producing unacceptable losses, was it possible the answer lay in unorthodoxy? Could pilots survive and strike more effectively by flying low? He chose experienced men, pilots who could think fast with their hands on the stick and whose judgment would not fray under the immediate terror of ground proximity. Among them was a captain whose name in some accounts appears as Walker Maharan or Maharin, Captain Walker Maharin, and a lieutenant listed as Robert Bob Johnson. These were not greenhorns. They had felt the cost of the old rule. They had seen comrades torn from the sky. They were willing to try something that on paper looked insane: hedge hopping, flying to the deck and using the terrain itself as concealment and advantage. The first experiment was almost shockingly simple. A tight group of P-47 Thunderbolts would descend below radar threshold, ride the contours of the land, and attack an enemy airfield from extremely low altitude. The result was immediate and dramatic. In the account the pilots left behind, the entire attack over the enemy strip lasted 11 seconds. 11 seconds of exposure, 11 seconds that changed the Luftwaffe's morning. Imagine the scene from inside the cockpit as they rolled in. The canopy vibrates. The oil temperature gauge is a small point of faith. The air is thick with diesel and the scent of warmed metal. Fields become a pattern. Trees are blades. With a practiced hand, the pilot banks, a hedge slides under the wingtip, and the target, a row of parked fighters, service crews, equipment, appears, sudden and close enough to make out helmets. The guns open. The report is a thunder that eats the gentle country sounds. In 11 seconds, P-47 strafed and destroyed aircraft on the ground. When they climbed away, there were no American losses from the run. Why did this dangerous-looking tactic work? The answer sits at the intersection of physics, human reaction, and technology. Radar in 1943 was brilliant for what it was built to do: detect objects at altitude, watch bomber streams, and cue fighters. But it had a blind spot. Near the ground, radar faced what engineers call ground clutter: the radar beam bouncing off every hedgerow, building, and field in an area, until the signal from an aircraft cannot be distinguished from the background. In plain terms, if the radar is listening to a choir made of birds, leaves, and fences, it is harder to hear a single voice whispering. Flying below roughly 500 feet put the P-47s into that whisper.
Controllers and radar operators could not reliably pick them out until they were on top of their targets, and by then there was often no time to vector interceptors effectively. Even when detection happened, reaction time was crushed. Command and control in the German system relied on cues passed from radar to controller to pilot. That chain takes minutes. From the American fighter's point of view, it became a contest of how fast can the defenders perceive, scramble, climb, find, and engage. Hedge-hopping turned that into a race the defenders could not win. The attackers had seconds, the defenders had minutes. Ballistics played a part too. Anti-aircraft artillery, flak, works on a timing problem. A heavy shell must be timed to explode where a target will be, not where it is. An 88mm shell, for instance, takes several seconds to reach effective detonation height. In that span, a high-speed target traveling close to the ground might have already moved beyond the calculated intercept point. Imagine you throw a rock to hit a running dog, and it takes so long to arc that the dog has left the yard. At low altitude, the ideal solutions for flak, firing a curtain of shells at the sky, become less effective because the geometry favors the attacker's fleeting silhouette and the ground-cut muzzle angles become less optimal. Then there is the human fallacy of deflection shooting. Air-to-air gunnery at speed relies on aiming ahead of a moving target, a technique perfected at altitude. Lower down, the erratic illusions of ground references and compressed perspective make judging lead both harder and more dangerous. A German pilot swooping to intercept at low altitude faces the hazard of miscalculating and slamming into treetops or hedges, or finding that the moment he breaks out of cloud or cover, the attackers are already gone.
Simply put, a fight won by height and time evaporates when the attacker erases the time. The P-47 Thunderbolt itself was not designed as a low-level murderer of airfields. It was a heavy, rugged machine optimized for high-altitude work, long-range escort, turbocharged power at altitude, and the ability to weather punishment. Yet, pragmatism and urgency forced adaptation. Engineers and mechanics grafted armor plates to vulnerable bellies, wrapped oil coolers in shields, and reinforced undercarriage points. Gun sights were adjusted for lower engagement profiles so that the pilot's instinctive aim translated into effective fire down to treetop height. Bomb racks and delivery techniques were refined so pilots could carry small ordnance into a hedge-hopping run and accurately release it without losing control. These were not cosmetic changes, they were survival modifications. Training changed more slowly but with greater intensity. Flying at deck height is a different discipline. Pilots learn to read the land like a map of threats and cover. Valleys, hedgerows, sunken roads, dry riverbeds all became features to exploit rather than obstacles to avoid. The most lethal training regimes were the ones that simulated compressed time, approaches that forced pilots to make kill or escape choices in seconds. Those who survived the early experiments became the instructors who turned hedge-hopping from a rogue tactic into a viable doctrine. There is a moral element in this technical evolution. What began as a risky experiment by a handful of pilots became a new canon because lives were at stake. These were not theatrical stunts performed for glory. They were desperate measures to save young lives and to preserve the bomber offensive's effectiveness. The men who volunteered to fly these missions understood that they were exchanging one set of lethal risks for another. Low-level flying traded the relative safety of altitude for the immediacy of danger from the ground. That trade-off was not taken lightly. After the successful first run, the tactic spread, first in small, controlled bursts, then as full group operations. Tactics matured rapidly. Instead of isolated runs, squadrons began coordinating simultaneous descents across multiple targets. The idea was to saturate local radar and scramble capability. If one group was seen, others were already on their way. Spring 1944 saw this escalate.
Reports from April through June detail coordinated strikes that systematically targeted Luftwaffe aircraft on their home fields and the ground infrastructure that supported them. Aircraft service and recovery became perilous. Technicians were killed or driven underground. Runways were damaged and airplanes left vulnerable. The effect on German air defenses was cumulative and corrosive. Airfields that once felt secure were suddenly risky to use. Dispersal was the obvious defensive answer. Spread out aircraft, camouflage, dig in revetments, and hide in revetments or forests. But dispersal imposes cost. Longer servicing times, worse maintenance, the loss of central control. The Germans had to alter how they organized their air assets, and in doing so, they ceded some efficiency and responsiveness. The surprise didn't just destroy planes, it forced structural change. There is a crucial tactical lesson in how little time was often required to inflict disproportionate damage. Consider the 11-second strike again. What can a small flight do in that interval? At 350 miles per hour, an aircraft covers roughly a mile every 10 seconds. In 11 seconds, coordinated gunners and pilots could rake an airfield's concentrated aircraft line, perforate servicing equipment, and leave chaos for the defenders to find. It was a brutal arithmetic. Speed plus surprise equaled outsized tactical effect. Not every strike went perfectly. Many hedge-hopping missions encountered heavy flak, and some pilots paid with their lives. The narrative of success must be tempered with the reality of losses that accompanied the tactic's early days. The P-47's newfound ability to survive hits thanks to reinforced armor did not make pilots invulnerable. Trees, wires, and errant bursts of ground fire remained lethal. Yet the empirical record from the units that adopted the tactic showed a meaningful shift. Lowered losses in certain mission profiles, higher enemy destruction rates on the ground, and a growing sense that low-level strikes could blunt the Luftwaffe's capacity to contest airspace over the invasion beaches. As the technique spread and was formalized, the organizational machinery adapted. Briefings incorporated hedge-hopping procedures. Intelligence officers began mapping enemy airfield vulnerabilities with the new tactic in mind, and maintenance crews learned to prepare aircraft for the stress of low-level operations. In April and May 1944, entire groups were sent on coordinated missions that looked nothing like the occasional rogue attack. These were planned, timed assaults with specific objectives: to deny the Luftwaffe the ability to launch effective fighters from particular fields for critical days in the campaign calendar. This wave of low-level activity had strategic consequences. By the time D-Day arrived on June 6, 1944, the Allies had not just attrited the Luftwaffe's numbers, they had forced changes in German airfield usage and readiness that translated into reduced Luftwaffe interference on the beaches. On D-Day itself, coordinated low-flying strikes played a role in keeping German fighters groping for targets, often delayed, dispersed, or simply not airborne when they were needed. That airspace denial mattered. Beachheads were profoundly vulnerable to air attack, and reducing the Luftwaffe's operational reach was critical to the invasion's success. It is important to underline the human calculus behind that success.
These tactics were invented and sharpened by pilots who understood the stakes, preserved the bomber offensive, and enabled ground operations at the cost of exposing themselves to new risks. The men who flew hedge-hopping missions were not theater actors. They were tactical innovators under pressure. Their experiments saved lives on a larger scale, even as they endangered those who volunteered. The moral footprint of such innovation is complex. A tactic that increased strategic effectiveness also demanded a willingness to accept heightened short-term danger. Beyond the immediate wartime payoff, the hedge-hopping concept left a doctrinal legacy. Flying low to exploit terrain masking, what later aviators and theorists called nap of the earth, became a permanent feature of air forces mindful of radar environments. The principle that ground clutter can be weaponized morphs into modern low-altitude attack doctrine and finds echoes in later aircraft design, the emphasis on rugged close air support platforms and pilots' training for terrain-following approaches. Machines like the A-10 Thunderbolt II, built decades later for survivability and close air support, inherit the pragmatic design philosophy of protecting vulnerable systems and allowing aircraft to operate effectively at low levels, where threats are close and detection is imperfect. Technical evolution, adding armor, protecting radiators and oil coolers, revising sighting systems, carried forward as well. The wartime modifications to the P-47 were not an ad hoc bricolage, but a feedback loop between frontline experience and engineering response. Pilots reported failures and vulnerabilities, mechanics and designers proposed fixes, commanders authorized experiments. The pace at which modifications went from sketch to hangar installations speaks to an industrial flexibility that was as decisive as tactical audacity. There are also cautionary notes here about innovation under fire. Quick doctrinal shifts require careful vetting. Hedge hopping worked particularly well against a certain set of defenses and with an aircraft whose ruggedness tolerated ground fire risks. It might have been less suitable with lighter airframes or in terrain that denied good egress. Lessons learned were context-specific. The Allies discovered that rather than replacing altitude advantage wholesale, low-altitude attack was another tool, one to be used when the tactical problem matched its strengths. The German response, predictably, was to adapt. Dispersal, camouflage, and reinforced ground defenses were immediate. The Luftwaffe attempted to build redundancies and to reduce the vulnerability of aircraft on the ground. Yet every defensive answer carries a price, and those costs eroded operational efficiency. For the Allies, the strategic victory was not merely the destruction of enemy aircraft, it was the imposition of choices on the adversary that degraded their ability to respond fluidly to Allied operations. One anecdote that crystallizes the tactic's shock value involved a particular hedge-hopping sortie in the months before Normandy. Local accounts from the German side describe crews suddenly witnessing their planes torn apart on the ground by what seemed like ghosts, aircraft that appeared out of hedgerows and were gone before a single effective complaint could be sounded. Whether every contemporary claim in the sources is numerically precise is another matter. Historians flag some of the casualty numbers as reported in the source, but the pattern is clear. The tactic repeatedly achieved the tactical surprise needed to impose disproportionate effect for minimal exposure time. This is the essence of the bold, low-flying strategy that took the Luftwaffe by surprise. A small window of vulnerability exploited with speed and courage. A few pilots, responding to untenable losses, challenged a sacrosanct doctrine and discovered a new vector. The immediate payoff was tangible: fewer successful German intercepts of bomber formations and a rising tally of enemy aircraft damaged or destroyed on the ground. The longer-term payoff was doctrinal and technological. Changes in aircraft design, training, and the strategic shaping of the air war. But it would be a mistake to call the story purely triumphant. Every advantage extracted from surprise carries a price. Pilots lost their lives in the early missions. Units paid in attrition as they converted bright young flyers into specialists trained for the nerve-wracking business of deck-level attack. Ground crews stationed on forward fields who had never imagined themselves in the line of fire found themselves victims of surprise. The strategic calculations that justified the tactic had to balance those costs against the lives and success saved at the operational level. Commanders made those judgments under the fog of war, and they were often the cruelest type of arithmetic. Yet the audacity of the decision, the willingness to break the oldest rule of air combat, offers a larger lesson in military innovation.
doctrine need not be doctrine until the data supporting it is refuted. When experience shows a method killing its practitioners at unacceptable rates, the bravery is not always in the daring attack, but in the willingness to change the plan. The hedge-hopping story is not simply about gutsy pilots. It is about a culture of learning under pressure. The front line provided the problem. A few thoughtful commanders and pilots sketched the experiment. Mechanics and engineers supplied the hardware fixes. Training codified the techniques, and gradually an insurgent tactic became an institutional tool. There are technical subtleties worth pausing over. Radar operators, for example, relied on height-finding techniques that compared return signals against a baseline. When an aircraft flew low, the return merged with land reflections and became statistically indistinguishable from noise.
That is why low flight could be described as being invisible to the systems of the day, an invisibility contingent on context and not some magical camouflage. If the attacker's approach was over a featureless plain with no clutter, they might be seen earlier. Over hedged countryside, they melted into the returns. Similarly, anti-aircraft fire effectiveness depends on lead time and geometry. A shell bursting in a curtain at an altitude calculated for an aircraft climbing to intercept is useless against an attacker skimming the field. Even proximity fuses, still in their infancy, did not change the core problem. The time-to-target calculation simply favored a fleeting, low-approaching bandit. Pilots also found that at very low levels, the reflected sound and sudden visual cues compressed decision windows in ways that benefited the aggressor, who had rehearsed the approach. The pilot's perspective in these moments, hands white on the stick, eyes scanning between the sight and the next hedgerow, was one of acute focus. There is a passage in one account where the investigator later wrote not about tactics, but about sensation. The country seemed to breathe under the plane, the noise was everything, and the bombs and bullets felt like weather. That sense of intimacy with the ground was both the tactic's strength and its moral cost. By the time the invasion fleet crossed the channel, low flying and other low-altitude innovations had contributed to an air environment far less permissive to German counterattacks. The Luftwaffe remained a fighting force, but it was a force stretched thin, forced into dispersal, and less capable of massing the kind of quick-reaction intercepts that had once shredded Allied fighter escorts. That operational paralysis, partial and localized, was enough to make a strategic difference. When ships teetered on the line between success and catastrophe, the sky overhead favored the Allies more often than not. After the war, analysts traced how many post-war doctrines and platforms had been shaped by wartime improvisations. The principle that terrain could be a shield rather than just an obstacle led to technologies and training that emphasized low-level performance and survivability. Engineers who had patched P-47s in muddy fields began to imagine aircraft built expressly to take punishment and do work at low height. The lineage is not strictly linear, but the conceptual seed, the recognition that low-level flight could be a deliberate operational choice, grew roots in aviation theory and remained part of the tactical lexicon. In closing, the story of the low-flying strategy that surprised the Luftwaffe is less a tale of heroics and more a study in adaptation. It is about a doctrine questioned in the face of unacceptable loss, about commanders who trusted pilots to test a hazard for the sake of greater safety, and about frontline feedback driving engineering and training change. It is a reminder that war accelerates learning, sometimes painfully, and that survival often favors those who can turn physics, terrain, and timing into asymmetric advantage. If this story grabbed you, like and subscribe, and tell us where you're watching from in the comments. We'll keep digging into moments where small decisions had huge effects. There are threads here worth following.
the P-47's rapid modification cycle, the grim training that produced specialist low-level pilots, and the detailed accounts of April through June 1944 strikes that baked hedgehopping into Allied operational planning. Watch the playlist on WW2 Air Tactics for deeper dives into those episodes. The boldness of flying to the deck cost lives and imposed new dangers, but it also saved others and reshaped the air war. Innovation, especially under fire, is often messy and moral in ways that statistics alone cannot capture. The hedgehoppers traded doctrine for immediacy, risk for surprise, and in doing so handed the Luftwaffe a problem that would not be solved simply by firing more flak. Their gamble changed the calculus of air combat, and for a critical season of the war, that change mattered more than anyone had expected.